Although Hartley's hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the glass of champagne a servant had pressed into her fingers only moments before. She set it down on the nearest table, afraid that everyone in the crowded ballroom could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. Just across the room, under a canopy of white roses and golden candlelight, Edmund Whitmore was tying himself forever to another woman. She should not have come. She had told herself that 100 times on the carriage ride to the estate, and she told herself again now, standing at the edge of the celebration in a pale blue gown that suddenly felt like the wrong choice. But the invitation had arrived at her door 2 weeks earlier, sealed with wax and written in careful, mocking script, and she had known immediately that refusing it would be its own kind of defeat. If she stayed home, everyone would say she was too broken to face him. If she came, at least she could prove them wrong. Except now, watching Edmund laugh with his new bride, Priscilla, Eloin was no longer certain she had proven anything at all. A year ago, she had believed she would be the one standing beneath those roses. She had believed Edmund loved her enough to withstand her family's modest fortune, that his affection would outweigh his mother's disapproval, and the whispers of society matrons who thought a marriage between an earl's second son and a woman with no dowry to speak of was beneath consideration. She had been wrong. When Priscilla Land arrived in London with her father's shipping fortune trailing behind her like a second gown, Edmund's affection had cooled with startling speed. Within 3 months, their engagement was broken. Within 6, his courtship of Priscilla was announced. Within a year, here they were, and here Eloin was too, standing alone in a room full of people who knew exactly what had happened and seemed determined to make certain she remembered it. "Poor thing," a woman murmured somewhere behind her, not troubling to lower her voice enough. "Imagine having the nerve to show her face." "I heard she still writes to him," another voice added, dripping with false sympathy. "Desperate, really." Eloin kept her spine straight and her chin lifted, the way her mother had taught her since she was a girl learning to walk in her first pair of proper shoes. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She turned slightly, pretending great interest in the arrangement of candles on a nearby table, and let the voices fade into the general hum of the celebration. It did not matter what they said. It could not matter. She had come to prove she was unshaken, and unshaken she would remain, even if it took every ounce of will she possessed. But it was hard. It was harder than she had imagined it would be, watching Edmund's hand rest at the small of Priscilla's back, watching him smile the same smile he had once given her, watching the life they now shared unfold in front of 200 guests who had once watched her plan a very different wedding. She had ordered the same white roses once, long ago, for a wedding that never happened. She remembered mentioning it to him, months before everything fell apart, saying she had always loved roses more than lilies. Had he remembered that too when he chose the flowers for this day? Or was it simply coincidence, one more small cruelty she was inventing in her own mind, because the real cruelties were not enough? She moved further from the crowd, toward the tall windows that lined the eastern wall of the ballroom, needing a moment away from the press of bodies and perfume and pity. Outside, the gardens were lit by strings of lanterns, swaying gently in the evening air, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine simply walking out into the darkness and never coming back, but that would only give them more to talk about. So instead she stood at the window, watching her own reflection layered over the garden beyond, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else in the world." The voice came from her left, low and unhurried, and Eloin turned with a start. She had not heard anyone approach. Standing beside her was a man she recognized instantly, though they had never once been introduced. Griffin Ashcombe, Duke of Wexford, was not a man one forgot, not because of his title, though that alone commanded attention, but because of the reputation that trailed him through every drawing room in London. He was said to be cold. He was said to be unforgiving in business and merciless in conversation, a man who suffered fools for exactly as long as it took to dismiss them. Mothers steered their daughters away from him, not because he was unkind to women specifically, but because he seemed entirely uninterested in the elaborate games of courtship that consumed the rest of society. He rarely attended events like this one. His presence tonight had already caused a ripple of surprised whispers when he arrived nearly an hour late, alone, wearing an expression that suggested he had somewhere else he would rather be. "I beg your pardon," Eloin managed, uncertain whether she should curtsy, uncertain whether the Duke was even addressing her or simply thinking aloud beside a window. "You have been standing here for exactly 4 minutes," he said, "and in that time you have looked toward the bridal party 7 times and toward the door 6 times. I imagine you are calculating how long you must remain before your departure would not seem like flight. Heat rose in her cheeks, embarrassment and something close to indignation tangling together. That is a very precise thing to have counted, Your Grace. I notice things, he said simply, as though that explained everything. It is not always a comfortable habit. She studied him properly then for the first time. He was tall, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds, unreadable in the candlelight. His expression gave away nothing at all, and yet she had the strange sense that he was watching her with more attention than anyone else in the room had offered her all evening, attention that felt less like judgment and more like understanding. If you have come to remind me that I am the subject of gossip tonight, she said, lifting her chin, you need not trouble yourself, I am well aware. I did not come to remind you of anything, he said. I came because I find weddings tedious, and this window offered the fastest escape from a conversation about horse breeding that I had no interest in continuing. Your presence here is incidental. Despite herself, the corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close enough that she felt it loosen something tight in her chest. How reassuring. I did not say it to reassure you, he said, though there was the faintest suggestion of dry humor beneath the words. I say very little to reassure anyone. It tends not to work in my experience, and I dislike wasting effort on things that do not work. Before she could decide how to respond to that, a burst of laughter rose from the direction of the bridal party, and Eloin's gaze was drawn there despite herself. Edmund had pulled Priscilla close for another dance, and several guests had turned to watch, murmuring approvingly. Somewhere among them, Eloin caught sight of Edmund's mother, Lady Whitmore, glancing in her direction with an expression of open satisfaction, as though Eloin's solitary presence at the window were the final proof of everything the woman had always believed about her. Eloin looked away quickly, but not quickly enough. Something in her face must have shifted, because when she turned back, the Duke was watching her with an expression that had changed, though she could not quite name how. You intend to stand here the rest of the evening, he said. It was not a question. I intend to survive the evening, she corrected. Standing here seemed the least complicated way to do it. It is not working particularly well, he observed. You have gone rather pale in the last several seconds. Thank you for noticing, she said, unable to keep a thread of bitterness from her voice. It has been a very illuminating conversation, Your Grace, but I should. Come with me, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, that made her pause before she could finish excusing herself. He extended his arm, not with any great flourish, simply offering it the way one might offer an umbrella in the rain, a practical gesture rather than a romantic one. Pretend you're with me. Eloin stared at him. I beg your pardon. You heard me, he said. Every person in this room who has whispered about you tonight is currently deciding what story to tell about you tomorrow. I am offering you a different story than the one they have already written. Take my arm, and for the remainder of this evening, you are not the woman who came alone to watch her former fiancé marry someone else. You are the woman who arrived with the Duke of Wexford. That is absurd, she said, though her heart had begun to beat faster for an entirely different reason now. You do not even know me. No, he agreed, but I know precisely what it feels like to walk into a room and have every person in it decide who you are before you have said a single word. I imagine you know that feeling rather well tonight. Something in his voice, some quiet current beneath the composed surface, told her he was not merely offering charity. There was a weight to his words that suggested he understood exactly what she was feeling, not as an observer but as someone who had lived it himself in some other room at some other time. She glanced once more toward the dance floor, toward Edmund and Priscilla turning together under the candlelight, toward Lady Whitmore's satisfied smile, and something inside her hardened into resolve. If I take your arm, she said slowly, you understand what will happen. Every person in this room will believe there is something between us. The gossip will only grow louder. Let it, he said. Gossip about being seen with a duke is, in my experience, considerably more flattering than gossip about being abandoned by an earl's second son. I am simply offering you the more favorable rumor. There was a boldness to the offer that startled her, and yet beneath the boldness was something almost gentle, an understanding she had not expected from a man whose reputation suggested he cared for no one's feelings at all. She looked at his extended arm for a long moment, weighing the risk of it, the strangeness of it, against the alternative of standing alone at this window for the rest of the night, while the whole of London decided her story for her. "Very well," she said finally, and placed her gloved hand on his arm before she could talk herself out of it. "But if you intend to embarrass me further, Your Grace, I promise you I will find a way to make you regret it." For the first time since she had noticed him, something that might almost have been amusement flickered across his face. "I do not doubt it for a moment," he said, and led her back toward the light. As they stepped away from the window, Eloin felt the shift in the room almost immediately, heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence, a ripple of surprise moving through the crowd like wind through tall grass. She kept her expression composed, her hand steady on his arm, though her mind was racing with the enormity of what she had just agreed to. She did not know this man. She did not know why he had approached her, or what he truly intended by drawing her into this charade in front of 200 witnesses. But for the first time all evening, walking beside him through the golden light of the ballroom, she did not feel like the woman everyone pitied. She felt, for just a moment, like someone worth watching for an entirely different reason. Near the refreshment table, Edmund's gaze finally found her, and Eloin watched his expression shift from polite indifference to open astonishment as he registered exactly whose arm she was holding. Beside him, Priscilla's smile faltered for the briefest instant before recovering into something brittle and uncertain. Eloin held Edmund's gaze for exactly as long as propriety allowed, neither too long nor too brief, and then let her attention drift away as though he were no more significant than any other guest in the room. It was, she realized with a small thrill she did not entirely understand, the first moment all evening that had felt like victory rather than survival. "You are smiling," the Duke observed quietly as they moved further into the room. "Am I?" she asked, genuinely startled to realize it was true. "You are," he confirmed. "It is a considerable improvement over 4 minutes ago." She glanced up at him, at the sharp lines of his face and the eyes that missed nothing, and wondered, not for the first time that evening, exactly what she had agreed to become part of. Whatever this was, whatever reasons lay beneath his sudden and startling kindness, she suspected the night was only beginning to reveal them. The morning after the wedding, Eloin woke to the sound of her aunt's voice carrying up the stairwell, sharp with excitement, calling for her to come down at once. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, trying to remember why her stomach felt tight with dread before the memory of the previous evening returned in full: the ballroom, the whispers, the Duke's arm beneath her hand, Edmund's stunned expression across the crowded room. She had not imagined it. It had happened, every strange and impossible piece of it, and now, apparently, the entire city already knew. "It is in the morning papers," her Aunt Beatrice announced the moment Eloin appeared in the small parlor downstairs, waving a folded newspaper as though it were a battle flag. "The Duke of Wexford, Eloin, you did not think to mention that you were acquainted with the Duke of Wexford." "I am not acquainted with him," Eloin said, taking the paper cautiously. There, tucked among the usual society notices, was a short paragraph describing the wedding of Mr. Edmund Whitmore to Miss Priscilla Land, and beneath it, almost as an afterthought that Eloin suspected had actually been the true point of interest for whoever wrote it, a note observing that the notoriously private Duke of Wexford had been seen escorting a Miss Eloin Hartley throughout the evening, the first time in recent memory that His Grace had shown any particular attention to a lady in society. Her stomach dropped. She had known there would be talk. She had not expected it to be written down, printed, distributed to every breakfast table in London before she had even finished her morning tea. "He simply offered me his arm," she said, setting the paper down with hands that were not quite steady. "It was a kindness, nothing more. I do not know why he did it, and I certainly do not intend to see him again." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, the particular expression she reserved for moments when she believed her niece was either lying to her or lying to herself, and Eloin was not entirely certain which one applied here. A man like that does not simply offer kindness to a stranger in front of 200 witnesses, Eloin, not unless he intends for it to be noticed. "Then perhaps he wished it to be noticed for reasons that have nothing to do with me," Eloin said, though even as she said it, she was not sure she believed her own explanation. She thought of the quiet certainty in his voice when he had spoken those 4 words to her, "Pretend you're with me," and the strange steadiness in his eyes when he studied her, as though he were solving some private puzzle only he could see the shape of. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of visitors. Word had clearly spread faster than Eloin could have anticipated, and by noon her aunt's small parlor had welcomed no fewer than 4 callers, each one arriving under the thin pretense of an ordinary social visit, while their eyes darted toward Elowen with unmistakable curiosity. Mrs. Fenwick, a long-time family friend, arrived first, declaring that she simply had to hear the story from Elowen's own lips, as though the newspaper account could not possibly be trusted. Elowen gave her the same careful, minimal explanation she had given her aunt, and watched Mrs. Fenwick's expression shift between disappointment at the lack of scandal and evident delight that there was, regardless, something to discuss. By the time the third visitor departed, Elowen had begun to feel less like a person and more like a piece of gossip being passed hand to hand, examined and reshaped with each retelling. She excused herself to the garden behind the house, needing air that did not smell of perfume and unspoken questions, and had barely settled onto the small stone bench beneath the old elm tree when she heard the front bell ring once more. "Not another one," she murmured to herself, closing her eyes briefly against the afternoon sun. But when her aunt's maid appeared at the garden door a few minutes later, her expression was different from the barely restrained excitement of the earlier visitors. It was something closer to astonishment. "Miss Hartley," the maid said, "there is a caller for you. It is His Grace the Duke of Wexford." Elowen's eyes flew open. For a moment she simply stared at the maid, certain she had misheard, but the girl's expression did not waver, and somewhere beyond the garden door she could hear her aunt's voice rising in a pitch of barely contained excitement as she ushered the visitor into the front parlor. Elowen smoothed her skirts with hands that felt suddenly clumsy and walked back into the house, her mind racing through a dozen possible reasons for his presence, none of which seemed entirely plausible. Perhaps he had come to clarify that the previous evening had meant nothing, to ensure she understood the arrangement had been temporary and confined entirely to the wedding itself. Perhaps he had come to apologize for the trouble the gossip had caused her. Perhaps, and this thought made her step falter slightly on the threshold of the parlor, he had come for some reason she had not yet imagined at all. He was standing near the window when she entered, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, studying a small watercolor painting that hung on the wall with the polite, distant attention of a man who had learned long ago how to appear interested in things that did not interest him at all. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression shifted, though as before she could not quite name what it was. "Miss Hartley," he said, with a slight incline of his head, "I hope I have not called at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all, Your Grace," Elowen said, aware of her aunt hovering near the doorway, practically vibrating with curiosity, and of the maid who had suddenly discovered an urgent need to rearrange flowers in a vase directly within earshot. "Though I confess I did not expect a visit." "I imagine not," he said. "I do not generally make social calls. My staff will confirm if you ask them that this is a rare and possibly alarming occurrence." Despite the tension coiled in her chest, Elowen felt the corner of her mouth twitch again, the same reluctant almost smile that had surprised her the night before. "Then I am honored to be the cause of such alarm." "You should be," he said, and there it was again, that dry thread of humor beneath his composed exterior. "Might I speak with you a moment?" "Perhaps in the garden, if your aunt does not object." Beatrice, who had clearly been listening to every word, made a valiant attempt to appear as though she had only just noticed the conversation, and quickly assured the Duke that the garden was entirely at his disposal, adding with poorly concealed eagerness that she would, of course, remain close by should Elowen require anything at all. Elowen suspected close by meant precisely near enough to overhear, but she said nothing, only led the Duke back through the house toward the small garden where she had been sitting only minutes before. Once they were beyond easy earshot, standing near the same stone bench beneath the elm tree, the Duke's posture seemed to ease slightly, as though he had been holding himself carefully composed for the benefit of the house, and could finally allow some of that formality to loosen. "I read the papers this morning," Elowen said before he could speak. "I imagine you did as well." "I did," he confirmed. "I expected as much, though perhaps not quite so quickly." "You expected it," she repeated, studying him carefully. "Then you knew last night exactly what would happen, that everyone would talk, that it would be printed for the entire city to read." "I did," he said without apology. "I am the Duke of Wexford, Miss Hartley. Very little I do escapes notice, however much I might prefer otherwise. I did not offer you my arm last night without understanding the consequences of the gesture." "Then why do it?" she asked, the question she had been turning over in her mind since the moment he had first spoken to her. "You do not know me. You had nothing to gain by drawing that kind of attention onto yourself, and yet you did it regardless in front of everyone who matters in London society. For a long moment the Duke said nothing, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, on the tangled roses climbing the garden wall. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual composure, replaced by something quieter and more considered. "I have spent a great deal of my life being watched for reasons that have nothing to do with kindness," he said. "People look at me and see a title, or a fortune, or a story they have constructed about my temperament from rumors they have never bothered to verify. Last night I watched a room full of people do precisely the same thing to you, and I found that I did not particularly wish to stand by and watch it happen." Eloin studied his face, searching for some sign that he was exaggerating or performing sympathy for effect, but she found none. His expression was entirely sincere, almost uncomfortably so, as though the admission had cost him something to voice aloud. "That is a kind reason," she said slowly. "But it is not the only reason, is it?" Something flickered across his face, quick and unguarded, before the composed mask settled back into place. "No," he admitted, "it is not the only reason, but I am not yet prepared to explain the rest of it, Miss Hartley, not today." "That is hardly fair," she said, though there was no real anger in it, only genuine curiosity now threading through her wariness. "You have already made me the subject of every drawing-room conversation in the city. The least you owe me is an explanation." "Perhaps," he agreed, "and I intend to give you one in time. But there is something I wish to ask you first, and I would ask that you consider it carefully before you answer, because I do not offer it lightly." Eloin's pulse quickened, uncertain what could possibly follow such a solemn preamble. "Go on, then." "My family has been pressing me toward marriage for some time," he said, "for reasons that have very little to do with affection, and a great deal to do with securing my position and quieting certain rumors that have followed me since my brother's death 2 years ago. I have resisted their pressure, because I have no wish to marry a stranger chosen for me by my relatives, and no patience for the elaborate courtship rituals society expects. But last night, watching you stand your ground in that ballroom despite everything arrayed against you, I found myself considering an arrangement that might benefit us both." Eloin went very still. "An arrangement," she repeated carefully. "A courtship," he clarified, "conducted for the benefit of the watching world. Nothing more than that, unless in time it became something more by genuine choice rather than obligation. You would gain protection from the very gossip that has followed you since last night, along with whatever social advantages accompany being seen in my company. I would gain relief from my family's constant pressure, at least for a time, without binding myself to a stranger chosen without my consent." "You are proposing a false courtship," Eloin said, the words strange and unfamiliar on her tongue, "between two people who barely know each other." "I am," he said simply. "I understand it is an unusual request, Miss Hartley. I do not ask for your answer today. But I would ask that you consider it, because I believe, whatever else is true between us, that we understand each other's circumstances rather well already, better perhaps than two people who have known each other for years." Eloin looked at him for a long moment, at the careful composure that did not quite hide the vulnerability beneath it, and thought of the ballroom the night before, of Edmund's stunned face, of the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being chosen rather than discarded, even if the choosing was, by his own admission, not entirely genuine. "I will consider it," she said finally. "But I make no promises, Your Grace." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, something that looked almost like relief passed briefly across his face before he composed himself once more. 3 days passed before Eloin saw the Duke again, 3 days in which she turned his proposal over in her mind more times than she could count, examining it from every possible angle, searching for the trap she felt certain must be hidden somewhere within it. She had grown up watching her mother navigate society with careful precision, choosing every word and gesture as though it might be the one that determined the family's fortune, and she had learned early that offers which seemed too favorable rarely came without a hidden cost. And yet, however many times she searched for it, she could not find the flaw in what the Duke had proposed. He wanted protection from his family's pressure. She wanted protection from the gossip that had already begun to reshape her reputation. It was, on its surface, a fair exchange between two people who understood exactly what they were agreeing to. What she could not quite account for was the way her chest had tightened when he spoke of considering something more, by genuine choice rather than obligation, and the way she found herself thinking of his voice, low and certain, far more often than the practical nature of his proposal warranted. She was still considering it on the fourth morning when her aunt appeared in the doorway of her bedroom, an envelope in hand, her expression a careful mixture of excitement and something that might have been genuine concern. "Another invitation," Beatrice said, handing it over, "from the Duke himself. He has invited us to a garden party at his estate this weekend. Both of us alone, which I confess I did not expect. Most men in his position would prefer to keep the chaperone at a comfortable distance." Eloin took the envelope, running her thumb along the elegant seal before breaking it open. The invitation was brief and formally worded, extending welcome to both Eloin and her aunt for an afternoon garden gathering at Wexford House, but tucked beneath the formal wording was a small, handwritten line that had clearly been added after the invitation was otherwise complete. "I would value your answer before then, if you are able to give it," it read in a hand that was precise without being showy, much like the man himself. "You have not told me what happened in the garden the other day," Beatrice said, watching her niece's face carefully. "You came inside looking as though you had received either the best or the worst news of your life, and you have said almost nothing about it since." Eloin hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal even to her aunt, who had always been more ally than interrogator but who also possessed an enthusiasm for social advancement that Eloin did not entirely trust with a secret this delicate. "He has proposed a courtship," she said finally. "Not a genuine one, not yet at least. An arrangement to protect us both from certain pressures we are each facing." Beatrice's eyebrows rose slowly. "An arrangement," she repeated, in much the same tone Eloin herself had used days before. "And what have you decided?" "I have not decided anything," Eloin admitted. "I do not know if I can trust him. I do not know if I can trust myself, for that matter, given how quickly I seem to have grown curious about a man I met only days ago." Her aunt was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that had softened considerably from its earlier eagerness. "Eloin," she said finally, "I watched you plan a wedding once before full of hope, and I watched that hope collapse when Edmund chose a fortune over a promise. I will not pretend I am not excited by the prospect of a duke's attention. But I would rather see you protect your own heart than see you rush into another arrangement that leaves you wounded, whatever advantages it might offer on paper." The warning settled into Eloin's chest, quiet but persistent, and she thought of it again that evening as she sat alone in her room, staring at the invitation propped against her mirror. Her aunt was right to caution her. She had been wounded once already by a man who had promised affection and delivered abandonment instead, and the Duke's proposal, however honestly presented, was an arrangement built explicitly on the absence of genuine feeling, at least for now. If she accepted, she would be walking deliberately into a performance of intimacy with a man who had been entirely clear that his primary motivation was relief from family pressure rather than any deeper interest in her specifically. And yet she thought, turning the invitation over in her hands, there was something different about the way he had spoken to her, something that did not feel like performance at all when they were alone together in the quiet of the garden. She thought of his admission, halting and uncomfortably sincere, about watching her stand her ground against a room that wished to see her crumble. That had not sounded like the calculated words of a man interested only in convenience. She decided, finally, that she would attend the garden party, not as an acceptance of his proposal, but as an opportunity to understand him better before committing to anything at all. If nothing else, she owed herself the chance to see whether the man in the quiet garden matched the reputation that preceded him everywhere else. The following days passed in a flurry of preparation that Eloin found faintly ridiculous given the uncertain nature of her relationship with the Duke, and yet she found herself caught up in it regardless, standing for fittings, debating the merits of one bonnet over another with her aunt, rehearsing polite conversation in the mirror as though she were preparing for a performance rather than an afternoon garden gathering. When the day finally arrived, she dressed in a gown of soft green that her aunt insisted brought out the warmth in her eyes, and climbed into the carriage with a knot of nervous anticipation coiled tight in her stomach. Wexford House, when they arrived, was grander than Eloin had expected, though she supposed she should have anticipated as much given the man's title. The garden stretched in careful, sweeping arrangements behind the main house, dotted with small groups of guests in bright afternoon dress, the murmur of polite conversation drifting through air scented with roses and freshly cut grass. She spotted the Duke almost immediately, standing near the edge of the terrace in conversation with an older gentleman, his posture composed and formal in a way that seemed, from a distance, entirely at odds with the man she had spoken to in her aunt's garden days before. But when his gaze found hers across the crowded lawn, something in his expression shifted, just slightly, a softening around the eyes that she suspected very few people in this garden would have noticed at all. He excused himself from his conversation and crossed the lawn toward her with unhurried steps, and Eloin felt her pulse quicken despite every effort to remain composed. "Miss Hartley," he said with a slight bow, "I am glad you came." "I was curious," she admitted, "to see whether the man who visited my aunt's garden was the same man who hosts elegant afternoon parties for the whole of London society." Something that might have been genuine amusement flickered across his face. "I confess he is not, entirely. This version of me is considerably more tedious. Shall I introduce you to some of my more insufferable relatives, or would you prefer I spare you the experience until you have had at least one glass of lemonade?" "The lemonade first, I think," she said, unable to fully suppress a smile. "I suspect I will need it." He led her through the gathering with an ease that surprised her, introducing her to a scattering of guests with brief, efficient descriptions that revealed a dry wit beneath his formal manner, and Eloin found herself, despite every reservation she had carried into the afternoon, genuinely enjoying his company. He was not the cold, unfeeling man his reputation suggested, not entirely. He was careful, certainly, guarded in ways she suspected ran deep, but there was warmth beneath the guardedness, flashes of it emerging in unexpected moments, a dry observation here, a flicker of real interest there when she spoke of her own opinions rather than simply agreeing with whatever was said to her. It was nearly an hour later, as they walked together along a quieter path at the edge of the garden, away from the main gathering, that Eloin finally found the courage to ask the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the invitation arrived. "You said in the garden the other day that there was more to your reasons than simply what you told me, about watching me and choosing to help me that night." The Duke's step slowed slightly, and for a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "There is," he admitted finally, "but it is not a simple thing to explain, and I would ask that you allow me a little more time before I do." "You keep asking for time," Eloin said, though not unkindly. "I begin to wonder if there is a story you are avoiding rather than merely delaying." He glanced at her then, something complicated passing across his expression, guarded and searching all at once. "There is a story," he said quietly, "and I promise you will hear it, but I would rather you know me a little better first before I ask you to carry the weight of it alongside everything else." Eloin studied him for a long moment, weighing the wisdom of pressing further against the strange, growing certainty that whatever he was protecting, it mattered enough to him that pushing too hard, too fast, might close a door she was only just beginning to understand had opened at all. "Very well," she said finally, "I will wait. But not forever, Your Grace." "I would not ask you to," he said, and something in his voice, quiet and sincere, told her that whatever secret he was carrying, it was heavier than he had yet allowed her to see. 2 weeks passed, and in that time the arrangement between Eloin and the Duke settled into something that resembled, at least outwardly, an ordinary courtship. He called on her twice more at her aunt's house, always with perfect propriety, always with Beatrice hovering somewhere nearby, though even she had begun to relax her vigilance as the visits grew more familiar. He escorted Eloin to a concert one evening, and to a small dinner party hosted by a cousin of his the following week, and each time, Eloin felt the strange doubled nature of what they were doing, a performance for the watching world that nonetheless felt, in its quieter moments, entirely genuine. It was at the dinner party that things began to grow more complicated. The evening had proceeded pleasantly enough, a small gathering of perhaps 20 guests in the elegant home of the Duke's cousin, Lady Ashford, who had greeted Eloin with a warmth that suggested she had already decided to approve of whatever was happening between her cousin and this newcomer to society. Eloin had spent much of the evening seated beside the Duke, engaged in the kind of easy conversation that no longer felt like a performance at all, when a familiar voice cut through the hum of the dining room, sending a jolt of unwelcome recognition through her chest. "Miss Hartley, I confess I did not expect to see you here." Eloin turned to find Edmund Whitmore standing at the edge of the table, having apparently arrived late to the gathering, his expression carefully composed into polite surprise, though something sharper flickered beneath it. Beside him, his mother, Lady Whitmore, wore an expression of thinly veiled satisfaction, as though she had been anticipating exactly this collision for some time. "Mr. Whitmore," Elowen said, keeping her voice level despite the sudden tightness in her chest, "I did not realize you were acquainted with Lady Ashford." "My wife's family has connections here," Edmund said, and Elowen noted with a small, private satisfaction the flicker of discomfort that crossed his face as he spoke the word wife, as though he had not yet grown entirely accustomed to it. "I understand congratulations are in order for you as well, though I confess I was surprised by the news. I had no idea you were acquainted with His Grace." Beside her, the Duke's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, a careful stillness settling over him that reminded Elowen, suddenly, of a predator gone quiet before it moved. "Miss Hartley and I are well acquainted," he said, his voice pleasant but carrying an edge that made Edmund's smile falter slightly. "Though I confess I am curious what news you believe warrants congratulations, Mr. Whitmore. We have made no formal announcement." "Forgive me," Edmund said quickly, recovering his composure. "I only assumed, given the attention you have shown Miss Hartley these past weeks, that an announcement was forthcoming." "Assumptions are a dangerous habit," the Duke said mildly, "particularly in company as observant as this one." He turned his attention back to Elowen with a warmth that seemed, to her surprise, entirely unforced. "Though I confess, Miss Hartley, that I have been considering the question myself rather more seriously than I initially expected to." Elowen's breath caught, uncertain whether the comment was intended purely for Edmund's benefit or whether it carried genuine weight. But before she could untangle the question, Lady Whitmore's voice cut smoothly into the pause. "How delightful," she said, though her tone suggested she found the prospect anything but. "I do hope, Miss Hartley, that you have learned from past experience the importance of securing a man's genuine affection before allowing yourself to become too attached. Some gentlemen, I have found, are rather more interested in convenience than in true feeling." The barb landed precisely where it was intended, and Elowen felt her cheeks flush with the old, familiar humiliation of being examined and found wanting in front of an audience. But before she could formulate a response, the Duke spoke again, his voice carrying just enough edge to silence the table's murmured conversation entirely. "An interesting observation, Lady Whitmore," he said, "particularly given that it was your own son who demonstrated precisely that preference for convenience over feeling, when he abandoned his engagement to Miss Hartley the moment a wealthier prospect presented itself. I would be careful, if I were you, about which lessons you choose to lecture others on." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Whitmore's face had gone pale, then flushed with unmistakable anger, while Edmund stared at his plate as though he wished the floor might open beneath him. Somewhere down the table, Elowen caught sight of Lady Ashford pressing her napkin to her mouth, clearly suppressing a smile she knew better than to display openly. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore began stiffly, "I hardly think—" "No," the Duke agreed pleasantly, "I do not believe you did. Perhaps we might return to more pleasant conversation. Miss Hartley, you were telling me earlier about your fondness for the theatre. I would be very interested to hear more." The conversation resumed slowly around them, guests turning back to their own discussions with the particular energy of people who have just witnessed something they will be discussing for weeks to come, and Elowen sat in stunned silence for a long moment, absorbing what had just happened. He had defended her, not with careful diplomacy but with open, deliberate force, in front of the very people who had spent the past year delighting in her humiliation. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly, once the table's attention had fully moved elsewhere. "I know I did not need to," the Duke said, his voice low, meant only for her. "I wanted to. There is a difference, Miss Hartley, and I would ask that you not confuse the two." She studied him for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar unfurling in her chest despite every effort to remain cautious. "You are not at all what your reputation suggests," she said finally. "Few people bother to look closely enough to find out," he said, and there was something almost weary in the words, a tiredness that spoke of years spent being misjudged by people who had never troubled themselves to look past the surface. "You are the first person in a long while who has." The remainder of the dinner passed without further incident, though Elowen was acutely aware of Edmund's occasional glances in her direction, unreadable and unsettled, and of Lady Whitmore's carefully composed silence, simmering beneath the surface like a kettle brought just short of boiling. When the evening finally drew to a close and the Duke escorted her out to her waiting carriage, He paused at the door, something hesitant in his posture that she had not seen from him before. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I did not intend for the evening to become quite so eventful." "You have nothing to apologize for," Eloin said. "I have waited a long time for someone to say those words to Lady Whitmore, even if I never expected it to be you." Something that might have been relief passed across his face. "I meant what I said," he added more quietly, "about considering the question rather more seriously than I initially expected to. I would understand if you believe I said it only for Whitmore's benefit, but I did not." Eloin's heart beat unsteadily in her chest. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "it is time you finally told me the rest of your story, Your Grace. I believe I have earned it." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her in the soft lantern light spilling from the carriage lamps, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful composure entirely. "Yes," he said, "I believe you have. Will you come to Wexford House tomorrow? I would rather tell you somewhere private, away from listening ears." "I will come," she said, and climbed into the carriage before either of them could say anything more, though she carried the weight of his unspoken story with her the entire way home, wondering what secret could possibly command such careful, guarded silence from a man who had just defended her so fiercely in front of the very people determined to see her diminished. Wexford House looked different in the quiet of the afternoon than it had during the crowded garden party weeks before, the gardens empty now save for a single gardener trimming hedges near the entrance, the great house itself standing solemn and still against the pale autumn sky. Eloin arrived alone this time, her aunt having agreed, after considerable persuasion, that a private conversation of this nature was better conducted without an audience, provided Eloin promised to relate every detail upon her return. The Duke met her at the door himself, dismissing the footman who arrived to take her cloak with a brief word, and led her not to the grand receiving rooms she had glimpsed during the garden party, but to a smaller, more private study lined with books and warmed by a low fire, the kind of room that spoke of a man's true self rather than the self he presented to the world. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit near the fire while he remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she had come to recognize as his particular brand of controlled unease. "You promised me a story," Eloin said gently. "I confess I have thought of little else since last night." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before, stripped of its usual composure. "My brother Edward was the Duke before me," he began. "He was everything I was not, warm, easy in company, beloved by everyone who met him. I was always the quiet one, the one who preferred books to ballrooms, and I confess I spent a great deal of my youth content to remain in his shadow, certain the title and its burdens would never fall to me." "But they did," Eloin said quietly. "They did," he confirmed. 2 years ago my brother was thrown from his horse during a hunt on our family estate. He lingered for 3 days before he died, and in that time I watched my family unravel in ways I had never anticipated. My mother has not fully recovered from the grief even now. My father, who died shortly before my brother in circumstances that were never entirely explained to my satisfaction, had left certain debts behind that Edward had been managing quietly, debts that fell to me the moment he died, along with a title I had never wanted and a family that suddenly looked to me for a strength I was not certain I possessed." Eloin watched him carefully, the careful control in his posture, the way his jaw tightened as he spoke, and understood suddenly the source of the guardedness that had followed him through every room she had seen him enter. "That is why society believes you cold," she said slowly. "They mistake grief and exhaustion for indifference." "Perhaps," he said, "though I confess I have done little to correct the impression. It has been simpler these past 2 years to let people believe what they wish to believe about me, rather than explain the truth to people who would likely use it against me regardless." He turned to face her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "There is more, Eloin. The debts my brother left behind were considerable, and in the process of untangling them, I discovered certain irregularities, evidence suggesting that my father's death may not have been as natural as everyone believed at the time." Eloin's breath caught. "You believe he was murdered?" "I believe it is possible," he said carefully. "I have spent the past 2 years quietly investigating, without drawing attention to my suspicions, because the men I believe responsible are men of considerable influence, men who would not hesitate to destroy me if they suspected I was close to proving anything against them. My family's pressure for me to marry is not simply about securing the family line, Eloin. It is about appearing settled, unremarkable, unthreatening, so that I might continue my investigation without inviting suspicion. The weight of what he was telling her settled slowly over Eloin, the pieces of the past weeks rearranging themselves into a new and more dangerous shape. "That is why you approached me at the wedding," she said. "Not simply out of kindness, but because I offered you exactly the kind of unremarkable courtship that would deflect attention from your true purpose." "That was part of it, yes," he admitted, and she heard beneath the words a careful honesty that cost him something to offer. "I will not pretend otherwise, but it was not the whole of it, Eloin, not even at the beginning, and it is certainly not the whole of it now. I have found myself caring for you in ways I did not anticipate when I first extended my arm to you that evening, and it troubles me greatly that I did not tell you the truth of my circumstances sooner. You deserved to know what you were agreeing to." Eloin rose from her chair, crossing the small distance between them, her mind racing with the implications of everything he had revealed. "Who do you believe was responsible," she asked, "for your father's death?" The Duke hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to answer, but finally he said quietly, "Lord Camden, my father's closest associate in business, a man who stood to gain considerably from certain shipping contracts my father controlled. I have found evidence, still incomplete, suggesting Camden manipulated my father's investments in ways that would have ruined him financially had he discovered the deception in time. I believe my father did discover it shortly before his death, and I believe that discovery cost him his life." Eloin felt a chill move through her, unrelated to the warmth of the fire beside them. "That is a dangerous accusation to carry, Griffin," she said, using his given name for the first time, the intimacy of it settling naturally between them despite everything else weighing on the moment. "It is," he agreed, "which is why I have told almost no one, and why I would ask you to be equally careful with the knowledge now that you carry it as well. If Camden suspects I am close to proving anything, I do not know what he might do to protect what he has built on the foundation of my father's death." "Then let me help you," Eloin said, surprising herself with the immediacy of the offer. "Whatever this arrangement between us began as, I do not intend to stand at a safe distance while you carry this burden alone. If our courtship is meant to shield you from suspicion, then let it shield you properly. Let me be more than an unremarkable companion, Griffin. Let me be someone you can trust." Something shifted in his expression, the careful control breaking apart into something far more vulnerable, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling softly in the quiet study, the weight of everything unspoken between them finally beginning to settle into something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of trust freely given rather than convenience carefully arranged. "I did not expect this," he said finally, his voice rough. "When I approached you that night, I expected a temporary arrangement, nothing more. I did not expect to find myself wishing it were real." "Perhaps," Eloin said softly, "it has become real somewhere between the ballroom and this study, without either of us fully noticing when it happened." He reached for her hand then, his fingers closing carefully around hers, and the warmth of the gesture settled through her chest like the first breath of relief after holding one's breath too long. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "I would rather face it with you beside me than continue carrying it alone." "Then you will not have to," Eloin said, and meant it entirely, the fear and uncertainty of what lay ahead tempered, for the first time in longer than she could remember, by the steady presence of someone who had chosen to trust her with the truth rather than continue hiding behind careful distance. In the weeks that followed, Eloin found herself drawn steadily into the quiet, careful work of Griffin's investigation, a world entirely unlike the ballrooms and drawing rooms she had known before, filled instead with ledgers and shipping manifests, and the kind of patient, methodical searching that required equal measures of intelligence and nerve. She discovered to her own surprise that she possessed a talent for it, a memory for detail and a patience for tedious documents that Griffin admitted, with something like admiration, exceeded his own. "You have found something," he said one afternoon, watching her frown over a stack of shipping records spread across the study table between them. "I can see it in your face." "Perhaps," Eloin said slowly, running her finger along a column of figures. "Look here, Griffin. This shipment, recorded as lost at sea in the spring your father died, the insurance payment on it was considerable. But this second entry, from a separate ledger your solicitor provided, records the same vessel arriving safely in Bristol 2 weeks after it was supposedly lost. Griffin leaned over her shoulder, his expression sharpening as he studied the pages she indicated, and Aloin felt a small thrill of satisfaction at having found something meaningful in the tangle of documents they had been sorting through for hours. "This is Camden's signature," he said slowly, tapping the second ledger. "He authorized the insurance claim on a vessel that had not, in fact, been lost at all. That is fraud, Aloin, clear and documented fraud, and if my father discovered this same discrepancy before his death, then he had exactly the evidence that would have ruined Camden had he lived long enough to use it," Aloin finished. "This could be exactly what you have been searching for." Griffin straightened slowly, running a hand through his hair, an unguarded gesture that had become increasingly familiar to her over the past weeks, evidence of the careful composure he no longer felt entirely compelled to maintain in her presence. "This is not proof of murder," he said carefully, "only proof of fraud, but it is a beginning, Aloin, a thread I can pull that may lead to the rest." "Then we should be careful how we pull it," she said. "If Camden realizes what we have found before you are prepared to act, I fear what he might do to protect himself." As if summoned by her words, a sharp knock sounded at the study door, and Griffin's butler entered with an expression of poorly concealed unease, informing them that Lord Camden himself had arrived unannounced and was waiting in the receiving room, having insisted the matter could not wait for a proper appointment. Aloin felt her stomach tighten with sudden alarm, and she saw the same tension reflected in Griffin's expression as he quickly gathered the incriminating ledgers from the table, locking them carefully into a drawer of his desk before turning to face her. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I will speak with him alone. If he suspects anything of what we have found, I do not wish you anywhere near the conversation." "Griffin, please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I cannot protect you and confront him at the same time, Aloin. Trust me in this." She hesitated, every instinct urging her to accompany him regardless, but she saw the genuine fear beneath his composed request, fear not for himself but for her, and she nodded reluctantly, allowing him to leave the study alone while she remained behind, straining to hear whatever might carry through the heavy door. The minutes that followed felt endless. She caught only fragments of the conversation drifting from the receiving room, Camden's voice raised at intervals in tones that shifted between false pleasantry and something sharper beneath it. Griffin's responses measured and controlled even as the exchange grew more heated. She could not make out specific words, only the rhythm of confrontation building steadily beneath the formal veneer both men were clearly working to maintain. When Griffin finally returned to the study some 20 minutes later, his face was pale, his composure visibly strained in a way she had rarely seen from him. He closed the door carefully behind him and stood for a moment in silence, gathering himself before he spoke. "He knows," Griffin said finally, "or suspects at least, that I have been investigating him. He did not say so directly, but he made it very clear that he is aware of my inquiries into certain shipping contracts, and he warned me, in language careful enough to avoid any direct accusation, that continuing to pursue the matter would be, in his words, unwise for everyone involved." "He threatened you," Aloin said, her voice tight with alarm. "He threatened us both," Griffin corrected grimly. "He mentioned you by name, Aloin, made a point of it in a manner that left no doubt he intended it as a warning. I do not know how much he actually knows about what we have discovered, but he knows enough to understand that you are no longer simply a convenient companion to me. He understands that you matter." Aloin felt a chill move through her, but beneath the fear something steadier settled as well, a resolve that had been growing steadily over the past weeks of careful, patient work. "Then we must move more quickly than we intended," she said. "If he suspects we are close, waiting only gives him more time to destroy whatever evidence remains or to take more direct action against us." Griffin studied her for a long moment, something complicated passing across his expression, admiration tangled with unmistakable fear. "I do not wish to put you in danger, Aloin," he said quietly. "If I had known when I first approached you at the wedding that it might lead to this, I am not certain I would have." "Do not finish that sentence," Aloin said firmly, crossing the room to stand before him. "I chose to help you, Griffin, freely and with full understanding of what it might mean. I will not have you take that choice away from me now simply because it has grown dangerous. Your father deserved justice. So does your brother, whatever role Camden may have played in the circumstances surrounding his death as well. I'm not going anywhere." Something in Griffin's expression softened, the fear giving way to something warmer, though the tension of the afternoon had not entirely left him. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "I do not know how I managed before you were part of this." "You managed poorly by the sound of it," Eloin said, a small smile breaking through despite the gravity of the moment, and she felt Griffin's answering laugh, brief but genuine, ease some of the tightness that had settled between them since Camden's visit. "We will need allies," Griffin said, growing serious once more. "Camden has friends in influential places, and if we intend to bring these findings before the proper authorities, we will need evidence solid enough that his connections cannot simply bury the matter before it is heard. My solicitor has been discreetly helpful thus far, but I believe it is time to bring in additional support, people whose loyalty and discretion I can trust absolutely." "Then let us begin," Eloin said, "before Camden decides that waiting to see what we discover is more dangerous than acting first." Griffin nodded, retrieving the locked ledgers from his desk drawer once more, and together they returned to the careful, methodical work of building a case strong enough to withstand whatever resistance Camden and his allies might mount against them. The quiet study filled once more with the rustle of papers, and the low murmur of two voices working in careful partnership, bound now by something far stronger than the convenient arrangement that had first brought them together. The solicitor Griffin brought into their confidence a careful, gray-haired man named Mr. Halloway, who had served the Ashcombe family for nearly 30 years, proved invaluable in the days that followed, his knowledge of legal procedure and financial record-keeping filling gaps in their understanding that neither Eloin nor Griffin had possessed on their own. Together, the three of them worked long into the evenings, cross-referencing shipping manifests against insurance claims, tracing the careful web of fraudulent transactions that Camden had constructed over the years, each new discovery adding another thread to the case slowly taking shape. But with each passing day, the danger surrounding them seemed to sharpen as well. Griffin insisted on escorting Eloin everywhere she went now, no longer simply for the sake of maintaining their public courtship, but out of genuine concern for her safety, and Eloin found herself growing increasingly aware of unfamiliar faces lingering too long near her aunt's house, of carriages that seemed to follow at a careful distance during her outings, of a persistent unease that had not existed in her life before Camden's veiled threat. It was nearly 2 weeks after that unsettling visit when the true danger of their situation revealed itself in full. Eloin had gone alone to visit a modest dressmaker's shop not far from her aunt's home, a rare outing undertaken without Griffin's company because he had been called away that morning to meet with Mr. Halloway regarding a newly discovered set of documents. She had just stepped out of the shop, a small parcel tucked beneath her arm, when a man she did not recognize approached her with unsettling directness, his expression carefully blank in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice pleasant but carrying an undertone that made the hair on her arms rise. "Lord Camden sends his regards, and a small piece of advice he hopes you will consider carefully. Certain investigations, once begun, prove difficult to halt safely once they have gathered too much momentum. He would hate to see harm come to someone so recently, and so publicly, attached to the Duke of Wexford." Before Eloin could formulate a response, the man had already turned and disappeared into the crowded street, leaving her standing frozen on the pavement, her heart pounding against her ribs. She stood there for several long moments, forcing herself to breathe evenly, to resist the urge to run blindly through the streets in search of safety, and finally made her way back to her aunt's house with careful, deliberate steps, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder the entire way. She sent word to Griffin the moment she arrived home, and he appeared at her aunt's door within the hour, his expression tight with barely controlled fury as she recounted the encounter. "This ends now," he said, pacing the length of the parlor with restless energy. "I should never have allowed you to remain involved once Camden made his suspicions clear. This is precisely the danger I feared, Eloin, and I will not have you pay the price for my family's unresolved grievances." "You will not have me pay the price," Eloin repeated, her voice sharper than she intended, "as though I have no say in the matter at all. Griffin, I chose this. I am choosing it still, even now, knowing precisely what the danger is. Sending me away would not make me safer, only more isolated, and it would leave you facing Camden's threats entirely alone, which I refuse to allow." Griffin stopped his pacing, turning to face her fully, his expression a complicated mixture of fear and something that looked almost like helpless admiration. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever encountered," he said finally. "I have been told as much," Eloin said, allowing a small, tired smile despite the tension still coiled tight in her chest. "Now tell me what we intend to do about Camden's very unsubtle threat, because I do not believe standing here arguing about my safety accomplishes anything useful for either of us." Griffin studied her for a long moment before nodding, some of the fury in his expression settling into something more focused and resolute. "Holloway believes we have gathered enough evidence now to bring the matter before the proper magistrate," he said. "The fraudulent insurance claims alone would be sufficient to see Camden charged, and once his financial affairs come under official scrutiny, I believe further evidence regarding my father's death may come to light as well, evidence Camden has thus far been able to keep buried through influence and careful concealment. But moving forward means moving quickly and publicly, before he has further opportunity to threaten either of us into silence." "Then let us move quickly," Aloin said firmly. "I would rather face this danger directly than continue living beneath the shadow of vague threats delivered by strangers on the street." They spent the remainder of that evening finalizing their plans with Mr. Holloway, who confirmed that the evidence they had assembled, while not yet entirely complete, was sufficient to bring formal charges against Camden for financial fraud, charges serious enough to force a thorough investigation into his affairs, an investigation that would almost certainly uncover the deeper truth about the elder Duke's death in the process. They agreed to present the evidence to the magistrate within the week, moving as swiftly as careful preparation would allow. But Camden, it seemed, had anticipated their intentions. 3 days later, as Aloin sat with her aunt in the small parlor reviewing the final arrangements for the magistrate's visit, a messenger arrived bearing an urgent note from Griffin, his handwriting hurried and uneven in a way that immediately set her nerves alight with alarm. "Holloway's office has been broken into," the note read. "Several documents are missing. I fear Camden intends to destroy the remaining evidence before we can present it. Meet me at Wexford House immediately. Trust no one else with this news." Aloin's hands shook as she folded the note, her mind racing through the implications of what Griffin had written. If Camden had already moved to destroy their evidence, then he understood exactly how close they had come to exposing him, and a man desperate enough to break into a solicitor's office was a man desperate enough, she feared, to attempt far more dangerous measures to protect himself. "I must go to him," she told her aunt, already reaching for her cloak. "Aloin," Beatrice said, her voice tight with worry, "if this man is as dangerous as you fear, perhaps it would be wiser to wait, to send word rather than venture out yourself in such uncertain circumstances." "I cannot wait," Aloin said, fastening her cloak with hands that trembled only slightly now, steadied by the same resolve that had carried her through every difficult moment of the past weeks. "Griffin needs me, and I will not abandon him now, not when we have come this close to finally seeing justice done." She climbed into the waiting carriage, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, and as the vehicle pulled away from her aunt's house into the gathering dusk, she found herself praying, more fervently than she had prayed for anything in a long while, that they would reach the truth before Camden found a way to bury it, and them entirely. The carriage had barely turned onto the road leading toward Wexford House when it lurched suddenly, throwing Aloin hard against the seat as the horses screamed, and the vehicle skidded to a violent, uneven halt. She heard raised voices outside, her driver shouting something she could not make out over the frantic pounding of her own heart, and before she could gather her bearings enough to react, the carriage door was wrenched open from outside, revealing not her driver but two unfamiliar men, their faces set in grim, purposeful lines that left no doubt about their intentions. "Miss Hartley," one of them said, his voice flat and businesslike in a way that made the moment feel somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. "Lord Camden requests your company." Lowen's mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to fight, to flee, to do anything other than comply, but the second man had already climbed into the carriage, his grip closing hard around her arm before she could formulate any plan of escape. She was pulled from the carriage into the gathering darkness of the street, aware distantly of her own driver lying motionless on the ground nearby, and forced into a second, plainer carriage waiting just beyond, its curtains drawn tight against outside view. The journey that followed felt endless, though she suspected later it had been no more than 20 minutes, her mind cycling frantically between terror and a fierce, burning determination not to let these men see how frightened she truly was. When the carriage finally stopped, and she was pulled roughly out into what appeared to be the courtyard of an unfamiliar warehouse near the docks, she found Lord Camden himself waiting, his expression carrying none of the polished civility she had witnessed during their brief encounters in society. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying a cold pleasantness that made her skin crawl, "I had hoped it would not come to this. I am not, whatever you may believe of me, a man who enjoys unnecessary unpleasantness." "Then release me," Aloin said, forcing steel into her voice despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "Whatever you believe threatening me will accomplish, you are gravely mistaken if you think it will stop the Duke from pursuing the truth." Camden's expression tightened, something dangerous flickering behind his composed exterior. "The Duke," he said, "is a young man consumed by grief who has convinced himself that his father's unfortunate accident was something more sinister. I had hoped, when I warned him weeks ago, that he would understand the wisdom of abandoning such fruitless speculation. Instead, he has drawn you into his obsession, and now here we are." "It is not obsession," Aloin said. "It is truth, and you know it, or you would not have gone to such lengths to silence us." For a moment, something almost like admiration flickered across Camden's face, quickly replaced by cold calculation. "You are braver than I expected," he said. "A pity. It would have been simpler if you had been the kind of woman who frightened easily." He turned to the men who had brought her, issuing a low, clipped instruction that Aloin could not fully hear, and she felt her heart pound harder as she realized, with sudden clarity, that whatever Camden intended to do next, he had no intention of simply releasing her once his point had been made. It was at that moment, as the warehouse door groaned open once more, that she heard a voice she recognized instantly, sharp with barely controlled fury, cutting through the tense silence of the courtyard. "Release her, Camden, now." Griffin stood in the doorway, flanked by two men Aloin did not recognize, though their bearing suggested they were not ordinary servants, and behind them, to her astonishment, she caught sight of a magistrate's official insignia glinting on the coat of a third figure emerging from the shadows. Camden's composure cracked visibly at the sight of them, his gaze darting between Griffin and the approaching officials with the particular panic of a man watching his careful schemes collapse in real time. "Ashcombe," he said, his voice tight. "This is a private matter. I would advise you to leave before it becomes something you regret." "It is far too late for that advice," Griffin said, striding forward with a fierce, unshakable calm that Aloin had never seen from him before, though beneath the composure she could see the raw fear in his eyes as his gaze found hers across the courtyard. Checking, she understood that she was unharmed. "Holloway's office was not the only place I had copies of our evidence stored, Camden. You destroyed nothing of value tonight, only confirmed, quite thoroughly, your own guilt in the eyes of everyone watching." The magistrate stepped forward then, his expression grave, addressing Camden with the formal, measured tone of a man well accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Lord Camden, you are hereby charged with financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and now, given tonight's events, the abduction of Miss Aloin Hartley. I would strongly advise you to come quietly." Camden's gaze swept once more across the courtyard, taking in the men positioned at every exit, the magistrate's unwavering expression, Griffin's fierce, protective stance beside Aloin, and something in him seemed finally to collapse, the careful mask of civility falling away entirely to reveal the desperate, cornered man beneath. He said nothing further, offering no resistance as the magistrate's men moved to restrain him, and Aloin felt the tension that had gripped her chest for the past hour finally begin to ease, replaced by a shaking, overwhelming relief that left her legs unsteady beneath her. Griffin was at her side in an instant, his arms closing around her with a fierceness that spoke of every fear he had carried since discovering she had been taken. "I thought I might lose you," he said, his voice rough against her hair. "I have never been more afraid in my life than I was tonight, Aloin, and I have faced a great many frightening things these past 2 years." "I am here," she said, her own voice unsteady, her arms tightening around him in return. "I am here, Griffin. You found me in time." "I will always find you," he said fiercely, pulling back just enough to look at her face, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole whatever breath remained in her chest. "Whatever comes next, whatever else this investigation reveals, I need you to know that none of it matters more to me than your safety. I should never have allowed you to be placed in this danger." "You did not place me in it," Aloin said firmly. "Camden did through his own guilt and desperation. I chose to stand beside you through all of this, Griffin, and I would choose it again even knowing what tonight would bring." She reached up, resting her hand gently against his cheek, feeling the tension slowly ease from beneath her palm. "We found the truth together. That is what matters now." Behind them, the magistrate's men were leading Camden away toward a waiting carriage, his earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man whose carefully constructed world had finally, irrevocably collapsed. Eloin watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and something that felt unexpectedly almost like sorrow for the years of deception and violence that had led inevitably to this moment, and for the truth about Griffin's father that would now, finally, come fully into the light. "It is over," she said quietly, though she was not entirely certain whether she meant Camden's threat or something larger, the long shadow of grief and suspicion that had followed Griffin since his father's death, finally beginning to lift. "Not quite," Griffin said, his voice softening as he studied her face in the flickering lamplight of the courtyard. "There is still a great deal to resolve, evidence to present properly, my father's memory to see finally, fully vindicated. But the worst of the danger, I believe, has passed tonight, and whatever remains, I do not intend to face it without you beside me." In the days immediately following the rescue, before the formal proceedings against Camden had even properly begun, Eloin found herself facing a different kind of difficulty, one she had not anticipated amid the relief of having survived the warehouse ordeal at all. The story of her abduction had spread through London with even greater speed than the earlier gossip about her arrival at Edmund's wedding, and while much of society expressed genuine sympathy and outrage on her behalf, a quieter, more troubling current of speculation had begun to circulate alongside it, one that questioned the very foundation of her relationship with Griffin. "They are saying," her Aunt Beatrice reported one afternoon, her expression tight with worry as she set aside yet another letter delivered that morning, "that the entire courtship between you and the Duke was never genuine at all, that it began as nothing more than a convenient arrangement to shield him from suspicion while he pursued his investigation, and that you were drawn into real danger only because you agreed to play a part in a scheme that was never truly about you." Eloin felt the accusation land with uncomfortable precision, not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it contained enough truth to sting. "It did begin that way," she admitted quietly. "Griffin has never pretended otherwise, not with me, but it did not remain that way, Aunt Beatrice. Surely that is what matters." "I believe you," Beatrice said gently, "but belief and public perception are rarely the same thing, my dear, and I fear this particular rumor may prove more difficult to overcome than the gossip that followed Edmund's wedding. People do not simply whisper that you were jilted this time. They whisper that you allowed yourself to be used, and that the Duke's affection, however real it may seem now, began as nothing more than a convenient performance." The rumor, once planted, seemed to take root with troubling speed. At a small gathering held to celebrate the progress of Camden's prosecution, Eloin overheard two matrons discussing the matter with the particular relish reserved for scandal that seemed almost, but not quite, resolved. Griffin, when she mentioned it to him later that evening, grew unusually quiet, his expression carrying a weight she recognized as guilt rather than simple concern. "Perhaps they are not entirely wrong to wonder," he said finally, staring into the fire of his study rather than meeting her eyes. "I did begin this deception for my own purposes, Eloin. I offered you my arm that night because your circumstances made you a convenient shield, not because I had any expectation of what would follow. If society wishes to question the sincerity of what exists between us now, I cannot entirely blame them for it, given how dishonestly it began." "Do not," Eloin said sharply, crossing the room to stand before him. "Do not allow their whispers to convince you of something neither of us believes to be true. Yes, it began as an arrangement. I have never denied that, not to myself and not to anyone who has asked me directly. But you told me the truth about your father, about Camden, about every danger we faced together, when you could have easily continued the deception without ever trusting me with any of it. That is not the behavior of a man using a woman for convenience, Griffin. That is the behavior of a man who came, somewhere along the way, to genuinely care what happened to her." Griffin turned to face her then, something raw and uncertain in his expression that she had rarely seen from him even during the most dangerous moments of their investigation. "I do care," he said. "More than I know how to properly express, Eloin. But I confess I fear that my own dishonesty at the beginning of this has poisoned whatever we might build together now, that you will always wonder, in some quiet corner of your heart, whether my affection is genuine or simply the natural consequence of circumstances I engineered for entirely different reasons." "Then prove it is genuine," Eloin said simply. "Not to them, Griffin, to me. I do not need grand gestures or public declarations to silence gossip that will fade regardless, given enough time. I need only your honesty, which you have given me consistently since the night in your study when you finally told me the truth about your father. That honesty is worth more to me than anything society chooses to whisper about how we began. He studied her for a long moment, something in his posture slowly easing, the guilt giving way to quieter, steadier resolve. You deserve better than whispered doubt following you through every room you enter, he said. I intend to see that resolved Eloin one way or another once Camden's trial has concluded and the truth of everything we have endured together is fully known. I will not have our beginning remembered as a deception when everything that has followed has been entirely, achingly real. The weeks that followed Camden's arrest passed in a whirlwind of formal proceedings, official inquiries, and the slow, careful unraveling of the full truth behind the elder Duke's death. As Griffin had suspected, the deeper investigation into Camden's finances revealed far more than simple fraud. A former groundskeeper on the Ashcombe estate, questioned as part of the official inquiry, finally came forward with an account he had kept silent for 2 years out of fear, describing a hurried, whispered conversation he had witnessed between Camden and a stable hand shortly before the elder Duke's fatal accident. A conversation that, combined with newly uncovered evidence of a deliberately weakened saddle strap, left little doubt that the accident had been no accident at all. Camden's trial, when it finally came, drew the attention of the entire city, every seat in the courtroom filled with spectators eager to witness the downfall of a man who had, for years, moved through society with unquestioned respectability. Eloin attended every session she was permitted to witness, seated beside Griffin as the careful, methodical case they had helped assemble was presented before the court, watching the transformation in Griffin's expression as testimony after testimony finally confirmed what he had spent 2 years quietly, desperately trying to prove. When the verdict finally came, delivered by a jury that had deliberated for less than an hour, Eloin watched something in Griffin's shoulders ease that she suspected had been carrying tension since the very night his brother died. Camden was found guilty on every charge, the judge's sentence severe enough to ensure he would trouble no one further, and as the courtroom erupted into a mixture of murmured astonishment and satisfied approval, Griffin reached for Eloin's hand beneath the railing, holding it with a fierce, quiet gratitude that needed no words to convey. "It is finished," he said quietly, once they had made their way out of the crowded courtroom into the cool afternoon air. 2 years of searching, of grief I did not know how to properly carry, and finally it is finished. Your father can rest now, Eloin said gently, as can your brother and you, Griffin. You do not have to carry this alone any longer. He turned to face her fully then, something in his expression shifting, the careful composure she had first encountered at the wedding entirely absent now, replaced by an openness that took her breath away each time she witnessed it. I have not carried it alone in a very long while, he said. Not since a woman I barely knew agreed to take my arm at a wedding neither of us particularly wished to attend. Eloin felt warmth spread through her chest despite the crowded street around them, despite the curious glances of passers-by who had clearly recognized them both from the recent, widely discussed trial. I believe you told me to pretend, she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. I do not recall agreeing to anything beyond that. No, Griffin agreed, his own smile breaking through, rare and genuine in a way that still, after everything they had endured together, caught her by surprise each time she witnessed it. You did not agree to anything beyond pretending. And yet somewhere between that ballroom and this courtroom, I find that I am no longer pretending at all, Eloin. I have not been pretending for a very long while now. Her heart quickened at the shift in his voice, the sudden seriousness beneath the warmth. Griffin. Let me finish, he said gently, and something in his tone made her fall silent, watching as he reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. His hands, she noticed with quiet astonishment, trembling slightly despite the composed strength he had shown throughout the entire ordeal with Camden. I did not intend for any of this to become real, Eloin. When I offered you my arm that night, I told myself it was a practical arrangement, nothing more, a mutual convenience between two people navigating difficult circumstances. But I have known for some time now that what exists between us is not convenience at all. It is something I did not believe myself capable of feeling again, not after everything my family has endured these past years. And yet here I am, standing before you, entirely certain that I do not wish to spend another day of my life without you beside me. He opened the box to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, catching the afternoon light with a quiet brilliance that seemed to Eloin to mirror the quiet, steady strength of the man offering it. "Eloin Hartley," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability written plainly across his face, "will you marry me? Not as an arrangement, not as a shield against gossip or family pressure, but because I love you entirely and without reservation, and because I cannot imagine facing whatever comes next in my life without you standing beside me as you have these past months." Eloin felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and entirely welcome, as she looked at the man before her, the man who had approached her at her lowest moment with nothing more than a whispered request, and had somehow in the months since become the truest partner she had ever known. She thought of the humiliation of that wedding, of Edmund's careless abandonment, of the year of whispered gossip and pitying glances that had followed her ever since, and understood with sudden and complete clarity that every painful moment of that journey had led her, unknowingly, toward exactly this. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly with the force of her own emotion. "Yes, Griffin, I will marry you. Not out of arrangement, and not out of gratitude for anything you have done, but because I love you as well, more than I believed myself capable of loving anyone again after everything that came before." Griffin's answering smile was unlike anything she had seen from him before, unguarded and radiant, the last remaining traces of the cold, distant reputation that had once preceded him through every drawing room in London finally, completely dissolved. He slid the ring gently onto her finger, and when he drew her into his arms, right there in the crowded street outside the courtroom where his family's long ordeal had finally found its resolution, Eloin felt, for the first time since Edmund's betrayal had shattered her sense of her own worth, entirely and completely whole again. News of their engagement spread through London society with predictable speed, though this time, Eloin found she did not mind the attention at all, no longer the subject of pity or scandal, but the center of a story that had, against every expectation, resolved itself into something worth celebrating. Even Lady Whitmore, upon hearing the news, was reported to have gone rather pale, though whether from genuine displeasure or simple recognition of how thoroughly her earlier cruelty had been outmatched by circumstance, Eloin could not say, and found, increasingly, that she did not particularly care. The wedding itself, when it finally took place some months later, bore little resemblance to the humiliating spectacle Eloin had endured at Edmund's celebration. It was smaller, warmer, filled with genuine affection rather than careful social calculation, her Aunt Beatrice weeping openly through the entire ceremony, Griffin's mother, finally emerging from the depths of her grief, watching her son marry with an expression of quiet, healing joy that Eloin suspected had been a long time in returning. As Eloin stood before the gathered guests, her hand resting in Griffin's, she thought back to that night nearly a year before, standing alone at a window while a room full of strangers whispered cruelly about her humiliation, certain that her life had reached its lowest, most painful point. She had not known then, could not have known, that a whispered request from a stranger, "Pretend you're with me," would become the beginning of the truest, most enduring happiness she had ever known. "No longer pretending," Griffin murmured to her, quiet enough that only she could hear, as the officiant began the ceremony that would bind them together for the whole of their lives. "No," Eloin agreed, her heart full to overflowing with a joy she had once believed lost to her forever. "Never again pretending, Griffin, only ever this. Only ever real." And as the ceremony continued beneath a sky washed gold with late afternoon light, surrounded by the people who had witnessed both the darkest and the brightest chapters of their unlikely story, Eloin understood with complete and unshakable certainty that every painful step of her journey, every whispered cruelty and quiet humiliation, had led her, finally and irrevocably, exactly where she was always meant to be.